The Conference of Parties, or COP, is to me like a toy train that stops at new destinations every year. Global heads come aboard to play a round of blame game, even as the ride teeters dangerously close to an environmental apocalypse.
This was how my colleague Mugdha Warrior described the biggest annual climate summit in the world. This was 2 years ago, November 2022, COP27. And we are back to that time of the year again.
COP29 is now underway in Baku, Azerbaijan.
COP29 summit is taking place at a time when, ironically, 2024 is set to be the hottest year in civilization of the longest time that it's been recorded.
The sound you hear is the ticking clock. We are in the final countdown to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Do you really want even further global instability costing precious life?
Now, by definition, COP, or the Conference of Parties, is a massive stage where more than 200 countries come together to 1. Take a status check on how much the world has progressed in dealing with climate change, 2. Find out new and innovative solutions to climate change. And of course, the urgency to find these solutions is increasing every single day.
India recording its highest ever temperatures, Delhi hitting 52.3 degrees Celsius.
The heat in southern Europe has been building since mid-April. Large areas are now red hot on this chart as temperatures are widely around 40 degrees.
Let's take you to Spain, and we now know that more than 200 people died after the devastating floods that they had there recently, particularly in the Valencia region.
A desert in Saudi Arabia received snowfall and hail for the first time in history. Residents flee to shelters as an Indonesian volcano continues to spew ash.
Tonight, wildfires raging in Chile have claimed at least 46 lives.
Cyclone Remel has left behind a trail of destruction.
Well, when the world is screaming Savdhan, Savdhan, you'd think a climate summit like this would be the most consequential congregation of humans to protect the world, right? Well, not quite. Because you see, the COP summits have largely reduced to really loud arguments between rich and poor nations on who will bear the larger responsibility of protecting Mother Earth. And this time, those arguments are reaching their shrillest decibels. Because this time, the focus is money.
COP29 must tear down the walls of climate finance. Developing countries must not leave Baku empty-handed. A deal is a must, and I'm confident it will be reached.
That was UN Chief Antonio Guterres in his kickoff speech for the summit. So, over this week and the next, the 200 participants at COP29 will try to thrash out a plan which entails multi-trillion dollars of investment towards climate action. This investment target is called the New Collective Quantified Goal. Why new? Because it will replace the previous target to pay $100 billion every year to tackle climate change. Who was to make that payment? Obviously the developed countries, because they are the largest emitters of carbon fumes. Who would be the receivers? The developing countries, because they are the biggest victims. So, did the rich nations pay up? No. In fact, most of them missed the first two deadlines in the decade-long tenure. And now, there is a much bigger target. Will they be able to meet this? Absolutely unlikely. Because you see, among other things, inflation has hit the developed world hard. So the money won't come from government coffers. Also, many of these rich countries are already borrowing a lot, and banks are not really beholden to climate finance targets. So where will the money come from? Nobody knows. So then, what's the point of COP29? That is what we'll try and answer in today's episode. Of course, while also trying to gauge where India, the voice of the global south, stands in all this. It's Thursday, the 14th of November. I'm your host Anirban Chaudhary. This is the Morning Brief. My first guest, Jay Asundi, is a climate scholar. He's done extensive research on pollution, on how science and tech is used for public policy framework, AI, and energy. He's an executive director at the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy, or CSTEP. Here's us. Hi Jay, very warm welcome to the Morning Brief.
Hi Anirban, good to be here. Good to speak with you.
Thanks for joining us from Baku, actually. So, firstly, between COP28 and 29, a lot has happened which has made the climate crisis more and more evident to the man on the street. How much more pressing has climate action become as something that touches the common man?
Hi Anirban, good to be here. Good to speak with you. The point that you made about climate change and the effects of it are being perceived by the common man even more so. The interesting thing is that earlier we used to always hear about it from the developing world, right? But now you're also seeing the ill effects of it happening in places like Spain, which you would think is a developed world. And I think it has resonated with a lot more people. An interesting thing is it has become more pressing for an additional reason also, because the research has shown that climate change effects will remain even after we get to net zero. So which means that apart from saying that, we are trying to limit the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we are going to see these effects continuing going forward. And I think that is a significant problem that we are going to face. And I think which is why it's more pressing. I think it's most important that we take the action now, and every delayed year is going to mean many, many more years of climate effects.
Jay, now from the point of view of India, and India being, sort of a representative of developing nations, it's been a very sort of a strong voice speaking for developing economies. The last COP was a lot about, pushback from the developing nations and holding the developed nations accountable. Do you see things looping in this COP29, or do you see things progressing from there to people coming to a similar plane or the developed side actually taking action, which the developing nations have been talking about?
So I think in last COP, it was all about also talking about coal. And I think that was where the pushback was, because the concern was that you're talking about coal, but you're not talking about natural gas, which is also a means for carbon emissions. And I think just pointing to coal was a problem. And so I think from that perspective, India had taken the stance that, look here, you cannot treat them separately. You have to be treating them similarly. And hence there was language related to that. I think India definitely plays a major role, because there are two things that work in India's favor. I think to one extent, what has happened is that India has walked the talk. I think Paris was one big step that India took. And at that time, everyone felt that we were over ambitious. And now sitting here today, 10 years later, there's already a conversation about ratcheting up the NDCs or looking at greater amount of contribution from India. So now the conversations that are going to happen is about who will pay into the fund. I think the biggest concern developing countries have is that it's going to be just more of the same. There's going to be just more lip service by the developed world towards the developing world. These are, again, discussions that need to be had, and it will have to come through multiple sources. It can't be just companies, but it'll also have to be through sovereign funds of some sort that will have to play a role in this particular fund that needs to be provided to the developing world.
And how effective would an event like COP be in ensuring that developed nations, their sovereign funds and their corporations play a role in supporting the rest of the world in battling climate change, rather than just paying lip service? Basically, what's the point of COP29? With this thought in mind, I went to ET's in-house expert on all things climate, Urmi Goswami. Hi Urmi, very warm welcome to the Morning Brief. Glad you could make time in what is a cold early morning in Baku.
Thanks for having me.
Right. So let's start by, you explaining me the state of play. What is really happening and how is COP29 different from COP28 as far as the first 2 days are concerned?
Okay, so COP29 is different because it's first time that finance is a centerpiece. Now, how is it different from COP28? Remember, in COP28, the first thing that got done was the loss and damage fund. And in a sense, the Azerbaijanis tried to replicate that by ensuring that the international carbon markets, the rules for it, which is in the Paris Agreement lingo, Article 6.4, got passed. But the problem with that happened is that it got passed late in the night, and after 9 hours since the formal handover of backroom negotiations on the agenda. And therefore, it kind of lost a bit of its power. So that's the one big difference. The other thing that to me struck me very clear is at one level, countries almost what one could call played a game of chicken. Because what had happened is the heads of delegation had their meeting on Sunday and to iron out the differences on the agenda. So what were the differences on the agenda is where would you house? I mean, it sounds very bizarre when one explains it, but it's very critical in this little universe of the COP. Where do you house the discussions on the implementation of the global stocktake that happened last year? On Sunday or Monday morning, it was matters related to finance. Developing countries wanted to keep it kept there, and developed countries wanted it to move under another rubric which dealt with the global stocktake.
What does that mean?
The global stocktake was, if you remember last year at COP28, there was an exercise to see, how much the world has done, where we are. So that, like taking stock of the first 5 years of Paris. That's the global stocktake exercise, which should feed into what is called the ratchet up mechanism. So once you do the global stocktake and you realize, okay, this is where we are, these are the things we need to do to increase our efforts on climate action, then that feeds into the next round of NDCs. If you remember, the next round of NDCs are due next year, February 2025. It's a big thing because what it means effectively is finance the big and only issue we are going to talk about? Is that the entire focus, or is finance one of the issues we are going to talk about? Like, it's how much spotlighting you're doing. So that was one fight. The second issue was a proposal that was put in, literally last minute, because it was just submitted a few days before the COP opened by basic countries, which are basically Brazil, South Africa, India and China, wanting a formal discussion on unilateral trade measures. Unilateral trade measures in this instance is all about CBAM. What is CBAM? Is the EU's, the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. And what that basically is that the European Union has a system within their country, which is the emissions trading system, where the standards are set for carbon content. And anything above that, industry has to pay for it or you trade it out. But basically, there is a price to pay if your carbon content is more than permissible. But imports all this while were not subject to that. What the European Union is trying to do is say that, look, if we are going to import stuff from your countries, if your carbon content is more, then we will levy a fee.
So if I understand correctly, from the developed nations point of view, it's more of let's see what we have done in the last 5 years before we commit to anything more, even as the nationally determined contributions or NDCs are in the offing, as early as February next year. Am I right in understanding this?
No, that is not correct. What the developed countries are saying is that last year we did this assessment and then we decided what we have to do in the next 5 years, that's from 2030 to 35, to basically get back on track to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C.
Right.
And let us talk about implementation. Now, that's the fun part, right? Because in the UAE consensus document, which is the document which has the outcomes of the global stocktake, question of implementation was in para 97 under finance. And that is why developing countries have said that, look, you want to talk about implementation, but you can't implement on love and free air. We need money and resources for that.
Correct.
And what the developed countries are saying is that, yes, we'll talk about money, but let's also talk about plans. Let's talk about the things we are going to do, such as, tripling of renewable capacity, doubling the rate of energy efficiency, addressing methane emissions. Let's talk about all of that as well. So it is not just a one track, only finance. Let's talk about all the other things that have to happen in implementing the outcomes of the global stocktake.
Understood. So, but isn't it more of the same every year? I mean, every time. Isn't this agenda fight or agenda debate going to hamstring actual action?
Well, If you think about it in a sort of a broader perspective, an agenda fight is really about differing perspectives and perhaps differing interests. The one thing that's true is that everybody who is in it is doing things. The question really is that, are we getting the kind of support we are getting? Developing countries say, hey, we don't get this support. We have been increasing our ambition, but we are running on fumes right now. So yes, it may seem that every year there's an agenda fight, but one is that the fight changes. Maybe the core fight doesn't change. It's always means of implementation versus action.
Right.
But the particulars of the fight change. But on the other hand, think about it in a very, everyday manner. There are roughly 200 parties. And each one of them come with their own context, their own sort of pathways. There is bound to be, differences of view. And
Understood.
airing it may not be such an unhealthy thing. Maybe, yeah, it's unhealthy, but that's part of the negotiation, right?
Got it. Okay, let's talk about the action on the part of the developed countries. I've been reading about, US and Japan announced the world's first climate sovereign guarantee for a financial initiative that was announced by ADB. US announced a methane fee. UK has new emission targets. But on the other hand, I've also been reading about developed countries saying that you are asking us to commit finance which is not in our hands. We have to approach banks for loans, etc. And we are already indebted. How do you expect us to do that? So where are the developed nations right now in terms of actual action?
So the first thing I would say is that perhaps we should stop creating monoliths. So developed countries, like developing countries, are not monoliths. The EU is perhaps the most sort of forthcoming. They put the most amount of money on the table. Now we can argue about, and rightly so, about the quality of their finance. A lot of times it's loans. So that's practically not very helpful. So technically it is climate finance, but not practically helpful. But they're the ones who sort of pledge X and they give that X. The US has never been the most reliable climate finance provider. Within the process, it promises things, but it hasn't delivered. So like President Biden promised 11 billion. We are yet to see a cent of that 11 billion. You have other countries which don't provide adequately. Canada, Japan to some extent, Australia. The only set of countries that actually provide what could reasonably call their fair share is the European Union and its member states like France, Germany.
Right.
Now, yes, their economies are under pressure. They're politically under pressure. But also on the other side of the the same equation is that the requirement has gone up because, we are suffering climate impacts. That hit has a bigger impact on the economy of developing countries because they're getting knocked down again and again. And because your bill has become bigger and bigger, the plea is basically we can't put that entire amount. So if you look at the conversation on climate finance that's happening, you have numbers like 1 trillion in public finance. Now, what developed countries are saying, we can't give you 1 trillion in public finance.
Got it. Let's talk about the developing nations now. For starters, G77 plus China, are they united on climate finance goals or, what is known as NCQG?
So it's not a straight answer. And I'm sorry, Anirban, I can never seem to give straight answers to these things.
Okay.
But the reason is this. Yes, they are united. They're united in the demand that developed countries need to do more, ensure more funds flow to developing countries, that they put more public money, that more money goes into things like adaptation, loss and damage. So there is a level of unity there. But the story is not at just that level. Then the question of access. If you look at the next turn, Amar Bhattacharya Veerasongwe report, you realize that most of the money that has been flowing in terms of climate finance remains within the developed countries and China. Basically, 2/3 of the world's population just gets about 15%. And then if you start disaggregating it, you realize that Africa gets virtually nothing and LATAM gets probably a little bit more, but that's the way it is. So then the questions arise about access. So a lot of times you will see small island states and least developed countries talking about Africa, in particular, talking about let's have regional sort of baskets. So they say that Africa needs X billion or X trillion. That is Africa's basket. So you have regional allocation. So that's when internally within the G77 there's a tussle. Right?
Got it. Two things that have caught my eye in the last few days that have become a big part of the climate change and climate action discourse on COP29. Inflation is one, with Simon Steele saying that climate finance is actually global inflation insurance. And the other thing is conflict with, whatever's happening in the world, Israel and of course Russia, Ukraine. Were they as big a part of the discourse last time and the previous times as well, or are they taking much larger space, mind space as well as space of discourse in COP29?
So the thing about provision of climate finance being an insurance against global inflation is in a sense a flipped out version of the cost of inaction. And you are hearing this formulation because the focus this year is so much on finance. But we have heard versions of this before. But on the other hand, you mentioned the economic sort of difficulties, the world as a whole faces and even developed countries face. So you can see all those things happening. So in a sense, the situation is getting not only more complex, but also dire. So I think it's a bit of that. And on the wars, of course, now...
And again, displacement, of course. Conflict and displacement, yeah. That's
now,
happening.
Conflict and displacement, these have been conversations before as well. If you remember when the war in Syria was happening, this was a conversation. If you remember at that point, there was a lot of talk about how climate change is one of those drivers of the conflict, in Syria and the displacement that was happening because of the war. I think the reason why we are hearing this in this formulation is because the focus is on finance. So suddenly the war is being seen in terms of how much it costs. If you remember last year, you heard about the war in terms of how much emissions it cost.
Correct.
So how much emissions was the Russian aggression on Ukraine adding? Yeah, how much emissions was the Israeli response to the Hamas attack adding?
Correct. Understood. Finally, Urmi, what are the three things that you see emanating from COP29 in the next 1 week?
Okay, now you're asking me to do crystal ball gazing, which I really can't. But if you want like broad sort of strokes, well, we will have an answer on NCQG. We already have something on the carbon markets. And we will have some kind of an outcome which relates to climate action. Everybody's playing it close to the chest. What you're still seeing are a high stakes game that's being played out, right? A game of chicken, as I said. But obviously, the question is, there has to be a quantum set. And there will be a quantum set. Now, is it 101 billion? Or is it 400 billion? Or is it 1 trillion? That is what remains to be seen.
Okay. I hope you find some time to look around Baku as well, although I don't see that happening too much. Thank you, Urmi, so much for your thoughts. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by Surohini Jain and sound designed by Indranil Bhattacharjee. Keep listening to us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, the 5th and latest episode of our special series, ET Wealth and Beyond, is out. In it, ET's markets editor Nishant Vasudevan talks to Pratik Oswal of Motilal Oswal and Firoz Aziz of Anand Rathi about the pros and cons of passive investing. This is a series in collaboration with the Bombay Stock Exchange. Do listen in. This is your host Anirban Chaudhary signing off. Have a good one. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.